FORA.tv. The world is thinking.
If you could give us a bit of a perspective of what you think is happening right now. Think of China's president talking about the protests in Tibet and reported in the New York Times last week. No responsible government will sit idle for such crimes, speaking about the Tibetans, which gravely encroach human rights, gravely disrupt social order, and gravely jeopardize the life and property security of the masses. So there's a kind of two narratives going on, and it seems that many Tibetans want to co-opt the Dalai Lama to push him into much more of a confrontative stance.
Yes.
And then the Chinese government want to demonize him. Sort of, how do you think he's doing in terms of weaving his way through that?
I think he's doing amazingly well, because his aim is to stitch the two narratives together into an interwoven narrative. And I think he's the only person between those competing narratives who sees that in any neighborhood, the only story that makes sense is one that takes into account all the neighbors and all the beings. That, in fact, the Tibetan situation cannot be resolved unless and until it takes into account the Chinese individuals who are at this point the majority of the residents in Lhasa. As you know, as soon as the disturbances broke out last month and the Dalai Lama led special prayers in Dharamsala, his exile home, the first people he mentioned in his prayers were the Chinese. So he's again trying to cut through the dialectic, I think. But you're right, the young Tibetans are ever more impatient with him, or at least with his policy on that front, and are raising the entirely understandable human cry, how can we sit by and do nothing and practice forbearance and tolerance while our cousins are being imprisoned, our mothers are being killed, and our country is being wiped off the map? And he is speaking for a larger picture and a longer term, and I think they will often say to him, well, you can do that because you're a very elevated, advanced monk, but we're human beings and we can't contain our sadness any longer. And I think he feels that pain more than any leader would, or more than any of the other people within the Tibetan community. I think the big discrepancy I notice is that most of the exiles in Tibet have never been to Tibet, sadly. That's the tragedy of their predicament. They've never been to China. And in fact, the one Tibetan in exile who really knows the Tibetans inside out is the Dalai Lama. As you said in your introduction, he's been a leader for 67 years. He's been dealing almost daily with the Chinese leadership since the days of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai 59 years ago. And I think he knows better than anyone that, as you said, to engage the Chinese confrontationally is only to bring untold suffering on Tibetans and Chinese who've already suffered so much. So and his first commitment as a monk is to nonviolence. So indeed, as you know better than I, to ask the Dalai Lama to endorse or promote violence is like asking the Pope to sanctify Satan. I mean, you can't do that, and he wouldn't be able to do that within his role. So I think his great clarity in this issue is to urge the whole world, including Tibetans, but the rest of us too, to speak and care passionately on behalf of the Tibetans without ever beginning to demonize the Chinese. And his hope always has been that he doesn't expect the Chinese government to wake up to its senses overnight, though he's prepared to do exactly the right thing as soon as they do. But he has great hope in Chinese individuals. And my understanding of his interpretation of Buddhism is that it takes place at the human level, one by one. And one of the most moving things that I saw recently on the same trip in Japan, I followed him into a room just like this. There were about 60 people here, very, very ragged, poor people. And as soon as he came into the room, they began sobbing. And they started prostrating themselves. And although there were beautiful chairs laid out, all the time he was offering Buddhist guidance, they sat on the floor. And as soon as he finished talking, they raced up to him and clutched him just to get his blessing or his touch. And every one of those 60 people was Han Chinese from the People's Republic. Just as he was saying to me 18 years ago that he has great faith in Chinese individuals waking up to the sense that they have more in common with Tibet than otherwise, that they're suffering under the same government. And I think the most fundamental thing, especially appropriate in a building like this, is that we all are conscious of how Americans, Australians, Japanese are reaching out for Tibetan Buddhism because we feel, or they feel, that it's answering some need that's not being satisfied in our own culture. But the people, of course, who are most reaching out for Tibetan Buddhism are the Chinese citizens who've been denied any form of religious practice for 60 years. And I think something in them is crying out, as in any human being, for just wisdom and clarity. And they realize that within the borders of China is one of the great, rich, ancient spiritual traditions. And the last time I flew to Lhasa, many of the Chinese I saw on the plane were literally going to make offerings at the central temple, to seek out Tibetan Buddhist teachers, even to find Tibetan Buddhist texts. It was an extraordinary thing. And of course, that will only happen slowly at an incremental level. I think the Dalai Lama, like most monks, is thinking in terms of centuries.